Hey everybody, this is Perch. I've got a slight cold, so my voice is a little bit deeper than normal here. But I've been wanting to do this one for a while. People have been asking for it for a while, and what's interesting is I was let down and then surprised over the course of this series. We're talking Blackest Night from DC, and when I say let down, I don't mean by the series itself. It's a very fun read. It's basically superheroes become zombies, and they have to be fought off. That's a cheap way of actually describing it. It's really tying into quite a lot of work around the emotional spectrum, the other Green Lantern rings, everything else. So, well, we'll get to that in a minute. But it was a fun event. It felt like a summer kind of popcorn event. A lot of things going on. And my assumption was it going to be higher sales than it was. We're going to walk through it, and your first impression might be, oh, it's actually lower than I thought. But then that's where this nice surprise comes in, because the effect of this series was actually extremely significant. So this is from Jeff Johns and Ivan Rice, and this is like Blackest Night. It was 8 issues, and it basically took place kind of over 2 years. It started in July of 2009, and it wrapped up in March of 2010. It had a skip month, January of 2010, and December 2009 was a little weird. Diamond decided not to ship the 5th week, and there were just it was a very weird month scheduling wise. Now we're going to walk through this, but like I mentioned, there's kind of multiple layers to this comic, and I think it tells us an interesting thing. Unlike a lot of the analysis you've seen, once you've done enough of them, you start to get a pretty consistent story. This one breaks a couple of those rules and those trends that we've talked about. So if you're looking at the screen right now, you're seeing that this title launched with a very strong 176,000 copies. It did have variant covers, of course, but they were not shipping anywhere close to the variant cover amounts that they do now. And even there, you do see a drop from issue 1 to issue 2, which we'll talk about, but it launches high. It was billed as a big summer event, and collectors and others came into it. What's a little bit difficult to convey in this picture is that from the Sinestro War to other elements that have been leading up to it, Jeff Johns had been writing Green Lantern. There was a lot of work that went into this storyline. The seeds of it had been placed easily, I mean, somebody could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at least 2 years ahead of time had been placed into this event. So we drop to 145,000, which is a significant drop, but it levels off with issue 3 at 140, then goes to 137. And then here's where, again, things start to be a little bit strange. In issue 5, it bumps back up to 144,000, which is strange. But then in December, something very peculiar happens. It drops massively down to 100,000. Now, why? I can't really explain this other than the entire comic market, everything dropped significantly. This is one area where I believe, and I'm not going to asterisk or anything, but I believe that the numbers may be underreported or something may be wrong. I double checked from what I have from Diamond and what I'm seeing on Comic-Con both, and this month is just weird. This was the number 1 selling comic at 100,000. Blackest Night had been in the top 5, usually the number 1 selling comic for every month it came out, but everything just kind of fell in December for no reason. So I believe that there's some numbers that are shorted there. I believe we're not getting the full story. It's one of those anomalies that kind of pricks my attention of something's wrong here, and I'd love to figure out what it is. But we skip January, and then in February, the title boosts back up to 130,000, and then in March, 135,000. So all in all, this is what we have for the series. It starts at 176, ends at 135. Every issue, but just barely, finished over 100,000, which is certainly nothing to to be upset about. But in some context here, it is this title. This title did certainly less sales than, say, Civil War II, which would come later. If you think about other events, it's not the strongest event. But it consistently sold. It hit a plateau and kept it, with the exception of that, basically that number 6 issue. And just in general, it's strong. You can't complain about this for an event. They made money. But this is not the end of the story. So before we go there, though, let's look at the trend line. And here it is. You see that very unusual 6th issue. It makes the whole curve very strange. If it wasn't there, then you basically have the drop from number 1 to number 2, which is expected. And then you have almost a Complete flat line. I mean, you go from 145 to 135. There's a little bit of a drop there, but nothing significant. This title held its audience, as you would expect. So, basically, if we're looking at that trend, 175,000 down to 135, this is a 23% trend drop over the course of 8 issues. But keep in mind, we are going from number 1, so we are counting in some collectors, speculators, and some variant covers. So, all things considered, a 23% trend drop is, nothing to be upset about. That's for an event comic, that's better than most. Civil War II, as I mentioned earlier, had a 41% trend drop. Doomsday Clock, as I recall, had a higher trend drop. So I mean, there's nothing wrong with this. It's fine. Doomsday Clock had almost a 60% trend decrease. If you remember from Doomsday Clock, it started at 280,000 copies, which is a crazy first issue, and then ended at 114. And so this is a success, 23%. But when I looked at this, Blackest Night has a huge number of fans who support it and like it and clamor for it and are really excited about it. So I was a little bit surprised to see it, frankly, this low. But this is where this single picture doesn't tell the full story. Because the one thing about Blackest Night, like lots of events, is it had tons of tie-ins. And more than many DC events, they really pulled out all the stops. You had a short series, you had the Interrupt regular series, it was in the Green Lantern Corps, it was in Green Lantern itself, there was a Batman series, there was a Flash series, there was a lot of tie-ins that came into this Blackest Night event. And what's interesting here, as we look at this picture, is if we go back to our 8 issues, but now you're going to understand why I kept that gap in there for January and April. In the top 10, for the very first issue, very first month, July, there were actually 3 Blackest Night titles in the top 10. Blackest Night itself, of course, but also Green Lantern and Green Lantern Corps. In the second month, again, 3 titles. In the third month, 5 titles in the top 10 were Blackest Night. 6 titles in October. So just consider this. Even though in October it sold basically 137,000 copies, just 137 copies, 6 of the books in the top 10, 6 books were all selling at or around 100,000, all tied into Blackest Night. This is definitely unique. We look at the rest. In November, it was 3. In December, this low month where it was only 100,000, again, 6 copies, 6 titles in the top 10 were all Blackest Night titles. In the month it skipped, where there was no core Blackest Night title, it still placed 3 of the crossover books in the top 10. In February, another 3. In March, another 3. And in April, after it ended, 3 titles in the top 10 were related to this event. Why is this significant? Well, this is a lot of comics. If you just add it all up, a significant amount of books got pulled up. And Green Lantern and Green Lantern Corps were doing great, but they were not regular top 10 material comics. They were just not there. This event drug everything else up, which is exactly what you want when you're doing an event. This series had the highest overall net gain for other books of any DC event in the last 25 years, and with the exception of Civil War, the first one from Marvel, it beats them as well. Only Civil War brought this many books into the top 10 with it, and Civil War did a little bit better, but this is very significant, because while it's one thing to say, well, things like Doomsday Clock technically sort of outsold it based on some of the first issue sold higher and a couple of the other things. Doomsday Clock didn't bring any other books into the top 10. Metal did not bring nearly as many books into the top 10 as this. So this book is good for DC as a whole. And this is the thing you kind of hang your hat on. This kind of explains that story. A lot of people remember this fondly. Well, they didn't just show up for Blackest Night. They showed up for the crossovers, which is always what these events are supposed to do. So that's pretty significant. Some concluding thoughts on all this. Blackest Night, as mentioned, it was on par with events like Identity Crisis, Final Crisis, Doomsday Clock, and other DC events. And in some cases, the 8 issues actually undersold some of those. Some of those books were just a little bit stronger. Identity Crisis sold higher across the board. It averaged out higher than what Blackest Night did, barely. It's almost the same, but just barely. But again, That's why this story is significant, because the upswing toward the end of the title and the series that immediately followed this was called Brightest Day. It was growing in popularity. Brightest Day did good right out the gate. It suggests that this book actually held better fan support, because not only did people show up to buy it, it started to gain over time, that one December weird month accepting, and it brought other titles up with it. The net effect it had on the remainder of the line was significant. Nearly every book, so I just was showing you the top 10, but if I go to the top 25, I think there's 2 exceptions. Every book that tied into this moved up into the top 25. It brought DC as an entire line up. And so that brings it, with the exception of the New 52, this, it's you can't call it an era for 8 issues, but this brief moment in time, this brief era, it would be the strongest of this century, by far. And if I continue to go back, I think I'd have to go back a very long ways before I saw this kind of gain across the line for, a single series and what it did. So a very, very interesting kind of outcome. This was a cool storyline. I mean, definitely it holds up. I have some numbers on trades, but this is a trade that's kind of frustrating because DC has reprinted in a number of different formats, so it's a little bit hard to tell what's going on. But it does well. It typically still hangs in there in DC's graphic novels when it's available, when it's in print. And, if we're thinking about what are the kind of the big storylines that could be adapted into movies that would probably move a lot of audience, this is one of them. It's why DC really does need to get Green Lantern right when it comes to the movies, because there's a lot of money there, and there's a lot of fan support, a lot you can do with it, a lot of franchise material, frankly, you can have with it. So interesting stuff. Thanks for pushing me. I know a number of people have been asking this for quite some time, and I admit I was surprised it was low, and then I was surprised it was so high. I got both of it. So thank you very much, everybody. If you have any questions, throw them in the comments below. I do read everything, and I'll take a look at it. Like and subscribe. You can figure out where to follow me in the description to this video. And hey, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, go to your podcasting of choice, iTunes, Google, Podbean, whatever, Pandora, whatever you like. And you can get a lot of information there as well without the ads, which is nice. But most importantly, thanks for listening.